The ER patient Typhon is a 2D horror game that features a woman who wakes up in hospital and finds she's missing both her arms. Atmosphere. Initially, I felt the art style would be a hindrance to the way the game is portrayed, but it works really well to juxtapose the horror, especially the game's gore. There's an extreme feeling of vulnerability that comes with losing both arms. You walk very slowly and your dash locks you in one direction as you run, which is very limiting. You can't speak to people and only operate things with your mouth for most of the game. It forces you to do a lot of unpleasant things to survive, like eating the cheese from a mousetrap or wading through dirty water to get to the next area. The whole game feels kind of vile and unpleasant, from the body horror that's constantly with you as you play to the grimy looking service tunnels. But even in moments when nothing is happening, especially in the early game, there's a creeping feeling of unpleasantness, that something is lurking just below the clean surface waiting to come out. Finding strange growths in the bathroom is just the beginning. The latter game gives you a pair of arms of your own and kind of goes into reverse horror, but there's still a lot of harrowing events even in the late game, but the feeling of vulnerability definitely tapers off around then. It's not a long game and keeps the atmosphere going for quite a long time. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game obviously uses a lot of body horror, and that aspect of it only gets worse as the game goes on, as your character develops arms of her own. The first time you see a small growth from where her arms used to be was frankly upsetting. But there is a great deal of tense and frightening moments that are sprinkled throughout the game. Some are more exciting with you outrunning monsters, and others are filled with pure dread. But what makes so many of these moments frightening is just how mechanical and skill-based they are, with you being very easily killed and the game requiring you to do things like walk carefully through a room full of flowers that will impale you if you make a mistake. The consequences of death are often forcing you to do the section again, and whilst it's generally quite forgiving, there are some sections that are just not fun to have to repeat. The most intense part of the game came from a brief red light, green light game where you couldn't move when the light was on, and that had me on the edge of my seat, and when the area's monster suddenly vanished from my view, I was definitely freaked out. There's one or two jump scares, but they're not that big of a deal and usually handled well. The enemy designs are interesting, but the art style leaves them feeling not particularly frightening, but it doesn't really matter much when the act of dying is more frightening than what kills you. I'd argue that most of the frightening moments come from around the midpoint of the game, with the early and latter game being a bit lacking, and some dream sequences that took place didn't really have much of an effect on me. Still, it's a valiant effort and does really well of what it's setting out to do. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music is pretty interesting, with what is usually just a single instrument playing eerie tunes with a lot of reverb. It's simple yet effective and gives a unique character to different parts of the game based on what instrument is playing. There's some creepy glockenspiel pieces and almost what sounds like a lap harp. The sound effects are a bit hit and miss, with some things being clearly unique and odd, but others sounding like stock effects, like the laugh of the antagonist, which I swear I've heard before. The voice acting really could be better, with a lot of characters having an odd pace to their lines or just seeming a little uninterested.
The caretaker just happened to drive by when it happened, so that the good doctor could help me. Well, that's the story he told me. I know it's not very interesting. I hoped for a story with me bravely fighting off some big shark attack.
On the other hand, the voice acting for the monster, James, was really good. I've never heard a monster sound so pained, but also sad.
What are you waiting for? Open that goddamn door.
There's a bit of directional audio, but it's not really a big requirement in a game like this. Overall, the sound design has a few flaws, but it's generally pretty good. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. The gore conflicts directly with the art style and it works really well. When you see bodies, they're so genuinely disturbing because of how disarming the characters are drawn, and with all the various growths and mutations that are taking place thanks to the rampant experimentation among the patients, there's some really gross things that you can stumble upon. The body horror of the main characters is just scratching the surface. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. You're awakened in a hospital bed with no arms, and after a visit to the doctor, you're told that you fell onto some rocks whilst climbing, and they had to take your arms to save your life. It's a distressing concept, and not one often covered to this level in horror games. However, it's obvious that there's something going on at the hospital from the very start. The staff are rude, and the feeling of suspicion only gets worse as you talk to the old lady, who basically describes how she lost her legs in the same rock climbing scenario as you. The old lady reveals way more than she should, and it feels like a story dump and comes off as a little convenient. The World War II experimentations were a bit out of place, and the story between James and Mary was a little undeveloped from what I picked up on. The story isn't bad, but it really needs a better way of conveying things other than the sporadic diary entries and conversations. Making a final score of 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. The game is a little slow to start, and some things don't always hit, but when they do, they tend to hit quite hard. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I died 38 times, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.